September 1943, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The morning arrives cold and clean, the kind of autumn chill that carries the smell of turning leaves and distant wood smoke. Behind double rows of barbed wire fence, a Japanese naval officer stands in a barracks doorway, holding a mimeographed sheet of paper that makes no sense within the universe of his understanding. The paper lists course offerings: American history, English composition, agricultural science, mechanical engineering, even music theory. At the bottom, in careful English and phonetic Japanese, an invitation. Prisoners may enroll in educational programs during their internment, taught by qualified instructors, leading to certificates recognized by American universities. He reads it 3 times. He checks for irony, for coded humiliation, for some psychological warfare trick he has been trained to recognize. He finds none. The paper is sincere. The courses are real. And this impossibility will fracture something deeper than his capture ever did. It will fracture his understanding of what enemies do to one another when the shooting stops. The officer had surrendered after his destroyer was sunk off Guadalcanal, pulled from the water more dead than alive by an American rescue boat that should have left him to drown. In the months of training before deployment, his superiors had been explicit. Capture meant dishonor beyond redemption, a fate worse than death because it carried not only personal shame, but ancestral disgrace. The manual distributed to Imperial Navy personnel stated clearly that prisoners could expect torture, starvation, forced labor until death. Better to die fighting. Better to take one's own life. Better anything than the humiliation of surrender. Yet here he stood, in a heated barracks in the middle of America, staring at a course catalog. The scale of the American POW education program was staggering in its systematic ambition. By 1944, over 425,000 access prisoners were held in camps across the United States. German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers spread across installations from Texas to Maine, from California to Florida. The War Department, rather than viewing these men as mere mouths to feed until repatriation, implemented a comprehensive educational initiative that included over 200,000 course enrollments by war's end. Prisoners could study everything from basic literacy to advanced engineering. Libraries were stocked with thousands of books. Instructors, some American civilian teachers, some educated prisoners themselves, taught courses that followed accredited syllabi. The quality was such that some universities agreed to grant credit for coursework completed in captivity, a bureaucratic miracle that assumed a prisoner might someday attend an American university and need those credits transferred.
For Japanese prisoners, the cognitive dissonance was total. They had been conditioned to expect extermination or enslavement. They discovered instead a system that treated education as a baseline human requirement, something to be provided even to enemies, even during war, even when providing it served no immediate military purpose. A Japanese sergeant, captured on Saipan after a final banzai charge had collapsed into chaos and death, wrote in a diary later obtained by camp administrators that his first English class felt like a hallucination. His instructor, a middle-aged woman from Milwaukee who had volunteered to teach at the camp, corrected his pronunciation with the same patient firmness she might use with any struggling student. She did not mention the war. She did not mention that her son had died at Iwo Jima. She taught English, grammar, vocabulary, sentence structure, as if such things mattered more than flags or empires or the blood that had brought them all to this unlikely classroom. The educational materials themselves became objects of wonder and confusion. Textbooks were new, printed on quality paper, illustrated with photographs and diagrams. Pencils and notebooks were provided free. There were typewriters for those learning office skills, microscopes for biology students, even musical instruments for the camp orchestra that formed at several installations. Japanese prisoners, accustomed to military life where every resource was scarce and every item had to be fought for or scrounged, could not reconcile this abundance with their understanding of total war. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Kyoto, described in his memoirs the surreal experience of teaching a calculus class to fellow POWs using textbooks better than any he had access to in Japan during the pre-war years. The Americans had given him chalk, a blackboard, and a room with heating. He'd expected to dig ditches until he died. The psychological impact of this educational infrastructure went far beyond simple re-education or propaganda. It demonstrated, through action rather than rhetoric, a fundamental difference in how the two nations conceptualized human value. Japanese military culture, particularly under the militarist regime of the 1930s and 40s, had constructed identity around service to the state. The individual existed to serve the collective, to sacrifice for the emperor, to accept death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. Education was a tool for creating obedient subjects. American educational philosophy, rooted in Enlightenment ideals of individual potential and democratic participation, treated knowledge as an inherent right, something that belonged to the person rather than the state. Even enemy prisoners retained enough humanity to warrant education, not because it would make them better soldiers, they would never fight for America, but because education itself was understood as a fundamental component of human dignity.
The symbolic object that recurred in prisoner testimonies and administrative records was the pencil. Not a weapon, not a tool of labor, but an instrument of thought. Prisoners wrote letters home describing their coursework, cautiously at first because they assumed their families would not believe them, then with growing detail as the reality settled in. Some letters were intercepted by Japanese censors and dismissed as American propaganda. Others reached families who kept them hidden, artifacts too dangerous to discuss during wartime, but too precious to destroy. After the war, when repatriation began and prisoners returned to a devastated Japan where universities had been bombed, libraries burned, and educational systems shattered, some carried with them course certificates from American camps, diplomas from a prison that had functioned better as a school than many pre-war Japanese institutions. Intelligence reports compiled by Allied authorities noted that Japanese POWs exhibited markedly different psychological profiles depending on when and where they were captured. Those taken early in the war, before the full brutality of the Pacific Campaign had calcified attitudes on both sides, often adapted more readily to the educational programs. Those captured later, particularly after battles like Okinawa, where Japanese forces had fought with suicidal desperation, required months to accept that their treatment was genuine rather than elaborate deception. But the transformation, when it occurred, was profound. Men who had expected death discovered instead the quiet radicalism of a classroom, a space where enemy and enemy could become teacher and student, where the boundaries of national identity blurred in the shared struggle to master differential equations or conjugate irregular verbs. The American motivation was not purely humanitarian. Military planners understood that educated, engaged prisoners were easier to manage than desperate, nihilistic ones. The education programs reduced escape attempts, lowered violence rates, and created collaborative relationships that made camps safer for both guards and prisoners. But the execution of these programs revealed something deeper than pragmatic prison management. They revealed an institutional commitment to the idea that even war could not justify the complete dehumanization of the enemy, that some principles, the value of education, the right to intellectual growth, the possibility of redemption through knowledge, transcended the temporary hatreds of national conflict.